I had just understood almost an entire podcast in English. I was actually feeling pretty confident. Then I made one tiny mistake. I paused the episode and thought, let me see if I can say that. It sounded so easy when the host said it. I had understood every single word. So I repeated the sentence, or at least I tried. For some reason, I couldn't say it the way I had just heard it. I stopped halfway through, started again, changed the rhythm, forgot the last word, and then I just sat there thinking, how is this even possible? I understood the sentence perfectly 10 seconds ago. So why couldn't I say it?
I know that feeling so well. The strange part is that it almost feels unfair. You're listening without any problems, following the conversation, laughing at the jokes, and then the moment you try to speak, it's like someone pressed a completely different button in your brain.
That's exactly what happened. While the podcast was playing, everything felt natural. I wasn't translating, I wasn't thinking about grammar, I was simply listening. Then I paused it, tried to say one sentence, and suddenly I felt like I'd forgotten English.
And that's usually the moment people become discouraged. They think, maybe I don't know as much English as I thought. But that's not really what's happening.
You know what's funny? If that had happened a year ago, I probably would have given up right there. I would have said, see, my English isn't good enough. But this time, I just kept thinking about it. Something didn't make sense.
What was bothering you the most?
The fact that I had understood everything. If I hadn't understood the sentence, I'd have accepted it. But I did understand it, every word, every idea. So why couldn't I produce the exact same sentence a few seconds later?
That's such an important question because a lot of learners experience the same thing without ever stopping to ask why. They just assume they're bad at speaking.
Later that day, I started thinking about my routine. I listen to English almost every day, sometimes while I'm driving, sometimes when I'm making coffee, sometimes during a walk. Podcasts have become part of my day without me even noticing.
Same here. There were weeks when I listened to English for hours every single day.
And then I remembered how difficult that used to be. The first podcasts I tried to listen to felt impossible. I'd understand one sentence, miss the next three, recognize a random word, and then I'd be completely lost again.
I remember that phase. I'd finish an episode feeling exhausted. It wasn't relaxing at all. My brain was working overtime just trying to follow the conversation.
Exactly. But little by little, things changed. I didn't notice it happening. One day, I realized I wasn't translating as much. Then I stopped pausing every few seconds. After that, I could actually enjoy the conversation instead of treating it like homework.
That's how progress usually happens. It's so gradual that you almost don't see it. Then one day you realize something that used to feel impossible has become completely normal.
Which is probably why I got so frustrated. I had made so much progress understanding English that I expected my speaking to be at the same level.
That expectation sounds reasonable until you look at how you actually spend your time.
Exactly. That's when I asked myself a question I'd never asked before. How many hours have I actually spent speaking English?
That's a dangerous question.
It really is, because I immediately started doing the math in my head. Hundreds of hours listening to podcasts, hundreds more watching videos, countless hours hearing English every week. But speaking? Honestly, probably just a tiny fraction of that.
And suddenly everything starts making sense.
It really did. I realized I wasn't comparing two skills that had grown together. One of them had been practicing almost every day. The other had barely left the starting line.
I think that's something most learners never realize. We often treat English as if it were one single skill, but it isn't. Listening, speaking, reading, and writing all improve together, yet each one also needs its own practice.
It's almost like going to the gym. Imagine spending months exercising only your arms. You definitely get stronger, but you wouldn't expect your legs to become stronger without ever training them.
Exactly, and nobody would think that was strange. We'd immediately understand why. But with languages, we expect speaking to magically appear just because we've spent enough time listening.
The crazy part is that listening wasn't a waste of time, not at all. Those podcasts helped me understand real conversations. They taught me expressions, pronunciation, rhythm, and vocabulary without me even noticing.
Absolutely. Listening is one of the best things you can do. The problem isn't listening too much, The problem is expecting listening to do a job that belongs to speaking.
That one thought completely changed the way I looked at my English. Instead of asking, why can't I speak like that? I started asking, what have I actually practiced?
And once you ask that question honestly, you stop feeling like you're failing. You simply realize that one skill has received much more attention than the other.
Honestly, that was a huge relief. For a few minutes, I thought there was something wrong with me. Instead, I realized I had just discovered the next step.
Exactly. Understanding that difference takes away a lot of frustration. And the best part is that the solution isn't becoming smarter or memorizing more grammar, it's simply giving your speaking the same kind of attention you've already been giving your listening. That's when things start to change.
After I realized that, I started paying attention to something I'd never noticed before. Almost every time I consumed English, I was completely silent. I'd listen, smile, laugh, understand, but I never actually opened my mouth.
I think that's more common than people realize. We spend so much time receiving the language that we forget language is also something we produce.
Exactly. It reminded me of learning to drive. Before I got my driver's license, I'd spent years sitting in the passenger seat. I knew where the pedals were, I knew what the steering wheel did, I understood the rules of the road. But the first time I actually sat behind the wheel, it felt completely different.
That's such a good comparison. Watching someone drive teaches you a lot, but your hands and feet still need their own practice. You can't skip that part.
That's when I stopped expecting speaking to happen automatically. Instead, I started wondering how I could practice without it feeling like another school assignment.
Because that's important too. If practice feels boring, it's hard to stay consistent.
Exactly. And then something funny happened. One morning, I was making coffee before work, and without even thinking about it, I looked at the coffee machine and said, "Come on, please work today."
In English?
Yeah, it wasn't planned, it just came out in English. Then I laughed because I realized I'd just had a tiny conversation with a coffee machine.
Honestly, I think we've all talked to objects at some point.
The surprising part wasn't talking to the machine, it was realizing how different that felt from trying to have a full conversation. There was no pressure, no audience, no fear of making mistakes. It was just one sentence.
And that's where many people get stuck. They think speaking practice has to mean having long conversations with another person, but speaking starts much earlier than that.
That tiny moment made me curious, so I started doing it more often. If I was looking for my keys, I'd say, "Where did I leave them?" If I opened the window, I'd say, "It's colder than I expected." If I was cooking, I'd describe what I was doing.
Those little moments add up much faster than people imagine.
They really do. And because the sentences were about my own life, I actually wanted to say them. I wasn't reading random examples from a textbook. I was talking about what was happening around me.
That's one of the biggest advantages. You're using English to express real thoughts instead of practicing isolated sentences that you'll probably never use again.
At first, my sentences were incredibly simple. I'm tired, I need more coffee, where's my phone? That was basically my vocabulary for a while.
And that's perfectly fine.
A few months ago, I probably would have thought it wasn't enough. I would have believed I needed to sound smarter.
I think a lot of learners feel that way. They try to build long, impressive sentences before they're comfortable saying short, natural ones.
Which is funny because that's not how we speak most of the time anyway. Think about yesterday. How many times did you say something really complicated?
Probably not many. Most conversations are full of simple sentences. I'm on my way. I'll call you later. That looks great. I forgot. Real life isn't one long grammar exercise.
That realization took a lot of pressure off me. I stopped trying to sound advanced and started trying to sound natural.
And usually that's when speaking becomes more comfortable. You're no longer chasing perfection, you're just communicating.
Another habit that helped me was reading out loud. I wasn't trying to memorize anything. Sometimes I'd open an article, sometimes a podcast transcript, sometimes just a few sentences on my phone. I'd simply read them out loud.
Did you notice a difference?
I did. At first, it felt awkward because I wasn't used to hearing my own voice in English. But after a while, the words started flowing more easily. My mouth became more familiar with sounds it had heard hundreds of times, but it barely produced.
I love that description. Your ears already knew those sounds. Your mouth was just catching up.
Exactly. And something interesting happened after a few weeks. I noticed that when I wanted to say a sentence during the day, it came out a little more naturally than before.
That's because speaking is physical too. Your brain is involved, of course, but your mouth, your tongue, and your rhythm are all learning together.
It's almost like learning a song. You can listen to your favorite song 100 times. You'll recognize it instantly. But singing it from beginning to end is a completely different experience.
That's a perfect example. Recognition and production aren't the same thing. They're connected, but they grow through different kinds of practice.
Looking back, I think I made speaking seem much bigger than it really was. I thought every practice session had to be perfect. Now I realize that saying 10 simple sentences during the day is already real practice.
And the best part is that you don't need to wait for the perfect moment. You don't need a classroom, a schedule, or another person. You can start wherever you are, using whatever's happening around you.
Which is probably why those little habits actually lasted. They fit naturally into my day instead of competing with it.
Exactly. Small habits are much easier to repeat. And when you repeat them often enough, they stop feeling like practice. They simply become part of your life.
After a few weeks, I started noticing something unexpected. I wasn't speaking perfectly, but I wasn't freezing as often either. The words didn't always come immediately, yet I felt calmer. That surprised me because my vocabulary hadn't suddenly doubled, my grammar hadn't magically improved, so what had actually changed?
I think your confidence changed before your English did.
That's exactly how it felt. I stopped treating every sentence like a test. Before, every time I opened my mouth, I wanted to prove that my English was good enough. Now I was just talking.
And that's a huge difference. When every sentence feels like an exam, your brain is under pressure. It's much harder to think clearly when you're worried about making mistakes.
I used to stop speaking the second I couldn't remember one word. I'd pause, get frustrated, and sometimes switch back to Portuguese.
I did the same thing. I'd think, if I can't remember the perfect word, I shouldn't say anything. Looking back, that was such an unrealistic expectation.
Because that's not even how we speak in our own language. Have you ever forgotten a word in Portuguese?
Of course, it happens all the time.
Exactly. And what do? We explain it differently. We use another word. We point at the thing. We laugh and keep talking.
We communicate. That's the goal.
But for some reason, when we're speaking English, we think every sentence has to be perfect from beginning to end.
I remember one day I couldn't remember the word receipt. I just stood there for a second, completely stuck. Then I said, "The paper they give you after you pay." The cashier smiled, handed me the receipt, and the conversation continued.
That's such a good example.
And you know what I realized afterward? Communication had happened. The missing word didn't stop the conversation. I was the only person who thought it was a big problem.
I had a similar experience while talking to a friend online. I wanted to say neighborhood, but the word completely disappeared from my mind. So I said, the area where I live. It wasn't the exact word I wanted, but he understood immediately.
That's a real communication skill. Being able to express the same idea in different ways is incredibly valuable.
It also made me realize that I knew more English than I thought. Just didn't always know the exact word I wanted.
And that's true even for native speakers. Nobody knows every word. We all explain things differently sometimes.
Another thing that changed was the way I listened to podcasts. Before, I was only paying attention to the meaning. Now I started noticing how people actually spoke.
What do you mean?
Their rhythm, the way they connected words, the little expressions they repeated without thinking. I realized native speakers don't invent completely new sentences every time they talk. They reuse patterns constantly.
That's such an important observation. Everyday English is full of familiar expressions. We hear the same sentence structures again and again.
Once I noticed that, I started copying some of those expressions, not because I wanted to sound like someone else, but because they felt natural.
That's exactly what children do in their first language. They hear useful phrases so many times that eventually those phrases become part of the way they speak.
One expression stayed in my head for days. Every time one of the podcast hosts agreed with something, he'd say, "That makes sense."
That's a great one.
I started using it with myself. If I figured something out, I'd say, oh, that makes sense. It sounds so simple, but after saying it enough times, it stopped feeling like a sentence I had memorized. It became something I naturally wanted to say.
I think that's one of the easiest ways to grow your speaking. Instead of memorizing huge vocabulary lists, collect expressions that real people actually use.
And because I'd heard them so many times, they already sounded familiar. I wasn't forcing myself to remember them. They were already somewhere in my memory.
Exactly. Listening had prepared your brain. Speaking was simply bringing those expressions into your active vocabulary.
Then I discovered another habit that made a surprisingly big difference. Sometimes I'd replay a short section of a podcast and immediately repeat what the speaker had just said.
Without waiting?
Almost immediately. I wasn't trying to analyze the grammar or translate anything. I was just following the rhythm and copying the pronunciation as closely as I could.
I love that exercise because it trains several skills at the same time. You're listening carefully, paying attention to pronunciation, and getting your mouth used to moving naturally in English.
At first, I could only repeat one short sentence before getting lost.
That's completely normal.
But after a while, I noticed I wasn't thinking about each individual word anymore. I was repeating whole ideas instead of building the sentence piece by piece.
There's actually a name for that technique. It's called shadowing. A lot of language learners use it because it helps connect listening and speaking instead of treating them as completely separate skills.
I wish I'd discovered it sooner. It never felt like memorization. It felt more like borrowing someone else's rhythm until I started finding my own.
I love the way you described that. You're not trying to become another person. You're simply giving your brain and your mouth more examples of natural English working together.
Looking back, I think that was the biggest change of all. I stopped asking myself, how can I sound fluent? And started asking, how can I practice in a way that feels natural?
And once you ask that question, the pressure starts disappearing. You stop chasing perfect English and start building real English, one conversation, one sentence, and one small habit at a time.
You know what's funny? A few months ago, if someone had asked me, do you speak English? I probably would have hesitated before answering. I would have started thinking about everything I couldn't do instead of everything I already could.
I think a lot of learners answer that question in exactly the same way. They don't measure themselves by what they can communicate, they measure themselves by every mistake they still make.
Which is a terrible way to judge progress.
It really is. Imagine doing that with any other skill. Imagine someone saying, I can't play the guitar, even though they can already play 20 songs, just because they can't play every song.
Or saying I can't cook after making a great dinner because dessert didn't turn out perfectly.
Exactly. We would never be that hard on someone else, but when it's our English, suddenly we expect perfection.
Looking back, I think I spent years waiting to feel ready. Ready to speak, ready to join conversations, ready to make fewer mistakes. The problem was that ready kept moving farther away.
Because confidence doesn't usually come before action. Most of the time, confidence comes after you've done something enough times.
That's probably the biggest lesson I've learned. I used to think confidence would make me speak more. Now I think speaking more is what slowly creates confidence.
I completely agree. Every small conversation teaches your brain something. Every sentence you finish, even if it's imperfect, becomes another piece of evidence that says, you can do this.
And something else changed too. I stopped seeing mistakes as signs that I wasn't improving.
What do you see them as now?
Proof that I'm actually using the language. Because if I'm speaking more, I'm naturally going to make more mistakes. That's just part of the process.
Exactly. People who never speak don't make speaking mistakes, but they also don't gain speaking experience.
That's such a simple idea, but it completely changed my mindset. Instead of thinking, I made 3 mistakes today, I started thinking, I spoke today. That's already progress.
And the funny thing is that most people don't even remember our mistakes. They remember whether the conversation felt natural, friendly, and easy to follow.
That's true. I honestly can't remember the last grammatical mistake someone made while talking to me in Portuguese.
Neither can I. If the message is clear, our brains move on. We're listening to understand ideas, not to give people grades.
Which means we're probably much kinder to other people's English than we are to our own.
Definitely. We're usually our own toughest audience.
So, if someone listening to this episode understands English but freezes every time they try to speak, what would you tell them?
I tell them that nothing is wrong with them. If you've spent months or years listening to English, your listening skills have been working out every single day. Your speaking simply needs the same opportunity to grow. It's not a talent problem, it's a practice problem.
I love that sentence.
Because it's true. And once you understand that, everything becomes much less frustrating. You stop asking, why am I so bad at speaking? And start asking, how can I practice speaking a little more today?
Not next month,
Not when you feel fluent,
not when you're finally confident,
today, even if it's just one sentence,
maybe while you're making breakfast,
or walking the dog,
or driving to work.
or talking to your coffee machine.
I still do that sometimes.
Honestly, so do I.
And you know what? Those little moments don't seem very important when they happen, but after weeks and months, they quietly become part of who you are. One day, you'll notice that you're thinking in English without trying. Another day, you'll answer a simple question without translating first. Then, you'll finish a conversation and suddenly realize, wait, I just spoke English for 5 minutes.
Those moments are incredibly special because they don't usually arrive with fireworks. They arrive quietly. You almost miss them if you're not paying attention.
That's exactly how understanding podcasts happened for me. I never woke up fluent. I just slowly became comfortable with something that once felt impossible.
And speaking follows the same path. Not overnight, not magically, just one small step after another.
So maybe the goal isn't waking up one day speaking perfect English.
Maybe the goal is simply speaking a little more today than you did yesterday.
I like that much better.
Me too. It feels realistic. It feels achievable. And most importantly, it keeps you moving instead of waiting.
If there's one idea I'd love you to remember, it's this. Understanding English and speaking English are not the same skill. If you're understanding more today than you were a few months ago, celebrate that. That's real progress. Now give your speaking the same patience, the same consistency, and the same kindness.
Exactly. Your English isn't stuck, it's growing. One skill might grow faster than another, and that's completely normal. Keep listening, keep speaking, stay curious. One day you'll look back and realize this wasn't the moment you were failing, it was the moment everything started to change.
Before we go, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever understood everything and then completely frozen when it was your turn to speak? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to read your story. And who knows, it might encourage someone else who's feeling exactly the same way.
We'd love to read your story, and who knows, it might encourage someone else who's feeling exactly the same way.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give this video a like.
It really helps the channel. And if you're new here, follow the channel so you don't miss our next conversations. Thanks for listening. Keep practicing, keep enjoying the journey, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.